this video, we are going to discuss about the posterior triangle of neck. We'll have an introduction to the topic. We'll discuss the boundaries, apex, roof, floor, divisions, and the contents of this triangle. First, we'll have an introduction to the posterior triangle of the neck. So, I'll just draw the neck. So this is the neck, and you are having an important muscle here. So if you draw the clavicle here like this, okay, you are having an important muscle here. That is the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So this is the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So this is the one muscle which is dividing the neck into anterior and posterior triangle. So if you look posterior to this posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid, you are able to see the posterior triangle. So the posterior triangle is a space on the side of the neck situated behind the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So you are having another muscle here, that is the trapezius muscle here. So this muscle is the sternocleidomastoid. So, and you have another muscle here, this trapezius. So posterior to the sternocleidomastoid, you are able to see a triangular space here. So this is a space which is located on the side of the neck between the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscle. So a few words about the posterior triangle. It is a space on side of neck situated behind the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So actually it is located posterior to the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid and in front of the anterior border of the trapezius muscle. So that is the posterior triangle. Now we'll discuss the boundaries of this triangle. So the next topic is the boundaries of the triangle. So I have drawn the side of the neck here. Well, one by one we'll draw the boundaries of the triangle. So first, the important muscle which is dividing the neck into anterior and posterior compartment is the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So the muscle, it goes like this. So this is the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Sternocleidomastoid. So another muscle here is the trapezius muscle. So this is the trapezius muscle. And these two muscles meet superiorly here on a line which is known as the superior nuchal line. Okay, so this is the superior nuchal line where the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid meet. Okay, that is the superior nuchal line. So here on the inferior aspect, you are able to see the middle 1/3 of the clavicle. Which bone is this middle 1/3 of clavicle is located here. So from the diagram itself, you can see the boundaries of the posterior triangles. I have said in the introduction that Posterior triangle is a triangular space located on the side of the neck posterior to the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. So which are the boundaries of this triangle? So boundaries are, so first we look at the anterior boundary. So anterior boundary is formed by this border, that is the posterior border of sternocleidomastoid. Posterior border of sternocleidomastoid muscle. And the anterior boundary posterior boundary is formed by, so look at this muscle, that is the anterior border of the trapezius will be forming the posterior boundary of the posterior triangle. So posterior boundary is formed by anterior border of trapezius. So now being a triangle, it has got an inferior border which is also known as the base. So now let's look at the base, or it is also known as inferior boundary. So base or inferior boundary of this triangle is formed by middle 1/3 of the clavicle. Middle 1/3 of clavicle. So now let's look at the apex here. So apex is formed by the superior nuchal line where the two muscles, that is the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid, meet. So apex is formed by superior nuchal line where the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid meet. So that is about the boundaries of the triangle. Anterior boundary is formed by posterior border of sternocleidomastoid. Posterior boundary is formed by anterior border of trapezius. Inferior boundary of base is formed by middle 1/3 of clavicle. Apex is formed by superior nuchal line where the two muscles, that is the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid, meet. So now we are going to discuss about the roof of this triangle. So we'll draw the triangle once more. So we have the two important muscles here. So first of all, the bone here, that is the clavicle. Two important muscles here, that is the sternocleidomastoid muscle and also the trapezius muscle here, which is forming the boundaries of this triangle. Okay. So what is actually forming the roof of this triangle? Very easy. So superficially you are having the skin, superficial fascia, and one more muscle in this region which is located in the superficial fascia, that is the platysma. So platysma is one muscle which is located in the superficial fascia in this region. So it is also forming the roof. Now we have an important superficial vein here, that is the external jugular vein. So external jugular vein, platysma, is also lying in the superficial fascia in this region. So and beneath that you are having one fascia, that is the investing layer of the deep cervical fascia, that is actually forming the roof of this triangle. So which all structures are forming the roof of this triangle? That is the skin, superficial fascia And the superficial fascia in this region is consisting of, it contains, which contains an important muscle here, that is platysma, and a superficial vein here, that is external jugular vein, and also posterior external jugular veins. So, and this superficial fascia also contains some unnamed arteries which are derived from the unnamed arteries derived from occipital artery, transverse cervical artery, and suprascapular arteries. So, and this region also contains a superficial fascia. In this region also contains, so actually these are structures are located in the superficial fascia, that is platysma, external jugular vein, and some unnamed arteries. And the fourth structure are, so actually the posterior triangle of the neck contains some cutaneous, posterior triangle contains some branches of cervical plexus. So actually these branches becomes cutaneous, and these cutaneous branches of the cervical plexus will be present in the superficial fascia. So which are the cutaneous branches of the cervical plexus present in the superficial fascia here? That is supraclavicular nerve, greater auricular nerve, transverse cutaneous nerve, and also lesser occipital. So these are all branches of the cervical plexus, and after piercing the deep cervical fascia, this becomes cutaneous. So parts of these nerves are lying in the superficial fascia. So cutaneous branches of these nerves are lying in the superficial fascia. So, and this also contains lymph vessels which pierce the deep fascia to end in the supraclavicular nodes. So the superficial fascia contains platysma, a muscle, external jugular vein, that is a vein, and some arteries, some nerves, and lymph vessels. That is easy to study. And the important structure which forms the roof of this triangle is the investing layer of deep cervical fascia. So the investing layer of deep cervical fascia is actually forming the roof of this posterior triangle of neck. So this is investing layer of deep cervical fascia. So it is also forming the roof. It is an important structure forming the roof, investing layer of deep cervical fascia. So you can see that the roof of this triangle is first from superficial to deep, that is skin, superficial fascia, and the superficial fascia contains platysma, external jugular vein, unnamed arteries derived from occipital, transverse cervical, and suprascapular artery, and the suprascapular nerve, greater auricular nerve, transverse cutaneous nerve, lesser occipital nerve. So these are the cutaneous nerves, and some lymph vessels. And the important structure forming the roof is the investing layer of deep cervical fascia. So that is how we describe the roof of this triangle from superficial to deeper aspect. Now we go into the floor of this triangle. So now we are going to discuss about the floor of this triangle. So I have drawn the triangle with the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius as boundaries, and also the clavicle here. So I'm going to describe the muscles which are actually forming the floor of this triangle. So from above downwards we have muscles here. So the first muscle, that is a part of this muscle, will be forming the floor. So part of this muscle is the semispinalis capitis. So this muscle is the semispinalis capitis. So below that you are having the splenius capitis. So this muscle is the splenius capitis. So the next muscle is the splenius capitis. The capitis. So and below that you are having another muscle, that is the levator scapulae. So this muscle is the levator scapulae. And next muscle is the scalenus medius. Scalenus medius. So these are the muscles which are forming the floor of this triangle, and these four muscles are covered by a fascia, that is the prevertebral fascia. So these four muscles are covered by prevertebral layer of deep cervical fascia. Layer of deep cervical fascia. So if you are asked about the floor of the posterior triangle, you should say that it is formed by the muscles semispinalis capitis, splenius capitis, levator scapulae, and the scalenus medius, which are covered by the prevertebral layer of deep cervical fascia. So these fascia covering these four muscles will be forming the floor of the posterior triangle. Now we'll go into the division of the posterior triangle. So now we will see the division of posterior triangle. You can see the posterior triangle, which is bounded by the sternocleidomastoid muscle, trapezius, and middle 1/3 of the clavicle here. So and there is one muscle here, that is the omohyoid muscle, which is going like this, and it's attached to the hyoid bone like this. So and this muscle is dividing the posterior triangle into a larger upper part and a smaller lower part here. So you can see from the diagram itself, you can see the larger upper part and the smaller lower part here. So the division is by which muscle? This is the inferior belly of omohyoid muscle. Omohyoid. So this muscle is dividing this posterior triangle into a larger upper part, which is known as the occipital part. Occipital part, and a smaller lower part, which is known as the supraclavicular or subclavian part. So that is the division of the posterior triangle. So posterior triangle is being divided into upper part and lower part by the inferior belly of omohyoid muscle. The division is upper larger occipital part and lower smaller supraclavicular or subclavian part. Now we'll go into the contents of the posterior triangle, which is very important. Now we are going to discuss about the contents of the posterior triangle. So while discussing the contents of the posterior triangle, first we will discuss about the contents of occipital triangle, that is the upper larger part or upper larger subdivision of the posterior triangle. So I will discuss the contents which is coming in the upper part first. So in the occipital triangle, so the important nerve which is present under the investing layer of deep cervical fascia, that is the nerve which is present just beneath the roof of this triangle, is the spinal root of the accessory nerve, that is the spinal accessory nerve. So that is important nerve which is present here. And if you see the spinal accessory nerve, how do you see the course of this nerve? That is the nerve starts just above the middle of the posterior triangle, just above the middle of the posterior border of sternocleidomastoid muscle. So it emerges a little above the middle of the posterior border of sternocleidomastoid muscle, and it runs through a tunnel in the fascia forming the roof of this triangle. That is, it is running through a tunnel in the investing layer of the deep cervical fascia, and it passes downwards and laterally like this and disappears under the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So this is the spinal accessory nerve. It disappears under the anterior border of trapezius muscle, just 5 cm above the clavicle. So 5 cm above the clavicle, it disappears under the anterior border of trapezius muscle. So this nerve is the spinal accessory nerve. Spinal accessory nerve. That is the spinal root of accessory nerve. So one content of occipital triangle is the spinal accessory nerve. So what is the course of this nerve? It is present just beneath the fascia forming the roof of this triangle. So which is the fascia forming the roof of this triangle? That is the investing layer of deep cervical fascia. So this nerve is present very close to the investing layer of deep cervical fascia, which is forming the roof of this triangle. So this is the only structure which is present just beneath the roof of this triangle. So and it passes or it emerges just above the middle of the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. It passes through a tunnel in the fascia forming the roof of this triangle. It passes downwards and laterally, and it disappears under the anterior border of trapezius muscle 5 cm above the clavicle. That is the course of this nerve. And second structure is cutaneous branches of the cervical plexus. So there are 4 cutaneous branches of the cervical plexus here, which forms a content here. So actually these nerves are piercing the fascia which is forming the floor of this triangle, and this becomes the content of this triangle, and at last it pierces the investing layer of the cervical fascia at different points and becomes cutaneous. So it finally it emerges in the superficial fascia also, and these cutaneous branches are also forming the content of the posterior triangle by piercing the fascia which is forming the floor of this triangle. At first it pierces the fascia forming the floor, becomes the content of the triangle, and finally it pierces the investing layer of deep cervical fascia at different points to become cutaneous. Okay, and first one is the cutaneous branch is the transverse cutaneous nerve. So transverse cutaneous nerve, it is actually a cutaneous branch of the cervical plexus. So what is the root value? It arises from the ventral rami of C2, C3. I'll draw the nerve here. So this nerve, after emerging from here, it is running transversely across the sternocleidomastoid and supplies the skin of the neck till the sternum. So that nerve is the transverse cutaneous nerve. It starts here. It runs transversely across the sternocleidomastoid and supplies the skin of the neck till the sternum. And the second cutaneous branch is the supraclavicular nerve. So this is another cutaneous branch of the cervical plexus. It is formed from the ventral rami of C3 and C4. So, and this now after emerging from here, it descends downwards and it divides into a medial branch, an intermediate branch, and also a lateral branch. So that is a supraclavicular nerve. So one thing which I have forgot to tell us about the spinal accessory now. So this is supplying which muscle? Both the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscle. So now we'll go into the supraclavicular nerve. As you have said here, the supraclavicular nerve as emerging from the ventral rami of C3 and C4. When it comes down, it divides into a medial branch. So actually this medial branch, it supplies the skin over the manubrium till the manubriosternal joint. What happens to the intermediate nerve? It passes downwards and it crosses the clavicle to supply the skin of the first intercostal space till the second rib. So, and what about the lateral nerve? It runs across the lateral side of the clavicle and acromion to supply the skin over the upper half of the deltoid muscle. So, you have to know that the supraclavicular nerve, which is also cutaneous branch of the cervical plexus, is forming a content of this triangle. And the third cutaneous nerve of the cervical plexus is a great auricular nerve. Great auricular nerve. So the great auricular nerve, it is the largest ascending branch of the cervical plexus and it is emerging from the ventral rami of C2 and C3 nerves. And so this is the greater auricular nerve. It is emerging from here. It is ascending upwards on the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and on reaching the parotid, it is dividing into anterior and posterior branches. On reaching the parotid, divides into anterior and posterior branch. So that nerve is the great auricular nerve. It is the largest ascending branch of cervical plexus. Great auricular nerve. It ascends upwards on the sternocleidomastoid and reaching the parotid divides into anterior and posterior branch. So anterior branch, it is supplying the lower 1/3 of the skin on the lateral surface of the pinna and also the skin over the parotid gland. And this branch connects the gland to the auricular temporal nerve. So this is the anatomical basis of the Frost syndrome. And there is a posterior branch which supplies the lower 1/3 of the skin on the medial surface of the pinna. So that is about the greater auricular nerve. You should know that greater auricular nerve, which is also cutaneous branch of cervical plexus, is forming a content of this triangle. And the fourth cutaneous branch is the lesser occipital nerve. Lesser occipital nerve. So, and this now is arising from the ventral rami of C2 segment of the spinal cord. So one thing which is particular about this nerve is that this nerve is related to the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. That is, it is seen at the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. It winds around the posterior border and it is ascending along the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. And it supplies the skin of the upper 2/3 of the medial surface of the pinna and adjoining part of the scalp. So the lesser occipital nerve is located along the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. It is winding around the posterior border and it is ascending along its posterior border to supply the skin of the upper 2/3 of the medial surface of the pinna and adjoining part of the scalp. So this is lesser occipital nerve. So another one is a lesser occipital nerve. So these are the four cutaneous branches of the cervical plexus which are forming the content of this posterior triangle. Actually, these nerves are piercing the fascia forming the floor. That is, they pierce the prevertebral layer of the deep cervical fascia first and becomes the content of posterior triangle. Then it pierces the investing layer of deep cervical fascia and becomes cutaneous and supplies the skin at these regions. So this one was the transverse cutaneous. Okay, and this one, which divides into a medial, intermediate and lateral branch, is the supraclavicular. So these four are the four cutaneous branches of the cervical plexus. Then another content. So all these are the nerves. Now we have vessels in this occipital triangle. So which are the vessels here? So vessels are very easy. There is one vessel which is crossing the apex of this triangle superficial to the splenius capitis. So that vessel is the occipital artery. So this end is the occipital artery. So this is the occipital artery. One vessel is the occipital artery, which is located near the apex. So another vessel is the transverse cervical artery. That is the transverse cervical artery. So to know the course of this transverse cervical artery, you should see that there is one muscle here, that is the scalenus anterior muscle, and there is another important muscle here which is forming the floor of this triangle, that is the levator scapulae and also the scalenus medius. So this was the levator scapulae and the scalenus medius. So remember these two muscles, and now we'll see the course of this transverse cervical artery. So and remember that between the scalenus medius and the scalenus anterior you have some trunks of this brachial plexus, that is upper trunk, middle trunk and lower trunk of brachial plexus, and from the upper trunk you are having the nerve to subclavius and also the suprascapular nerve like this. So in order to see the course of the transverse cervical artery, first you should see that transverse cervical artery is a branch of thyrocervical trunk. So how it passes here? Thyrocervical trunk. So it passes in front of the scalenus anterior muscle. Then it is crossing the upper trunks of the brachial plexus. Then it crosses the nerve to subclavius and the suprascapular nerve, supraclavicular nerve. And also the scalenus medius muscle. Now at the anterior border of the levator scapula, it divides into superficial and deep branch. So this artery is the transverse cervical artery. So it is passing in front of the scalenus anterior. It is crossing the upper trunks of the brachial plexus and also the nerve to subclavius and the suprascapular nerve, the scalenus medius muscle, and on reaching the anterior border of the levator scapula, it divides into anterior and posterior branch. So it is crossed by the inferior belly of the homohyoid. So that is the two vessels which are forming the content of the occipital triangle. Now which are the muscular branches, muscular nerves which are forming the content? So which are the muscular branches of the nerves which are forming the content? So first there is a two muscular branch to the levator scapular muscle. It is two muscular branches to levator scapulae muscle. So which is the root valley, that is C3, C4, and there are two muscular branches to trapezius muscle. So again the root value is C3, C4, and there is a dorsal scapular nerve. So that is again proprioceptive, which is derived from, that is also known as nerve to rhomboids. Rhomboid. So it is derived from the C5 root. So what is the cause of this nerve? This nerve, it is piercing the scalenus medius and passing deep to the levator scapulae muscle, and where it, after passing deep to the levator scapulae, it reaches the back and lies deep or anterior to the rhomboid muscle. So the nerve to rhomboid or the dorsal scapular nerve, it is passing or piercing the scalenus medius and passing under the levator scapulae and reaching the back where it lies anterior to the rhomboid muscle and supplies it. So these are the three muscular branches which are present in this posterior triangle. There is muscular branch to the levator scapulae, and there is muscular branch to the trapezius muscle, and a dorsal scapular nerve which is or nerve to rhomboids which is supplying the rhomboid muscle. Okay, and we have seen the nerves and the vessels in this region, and there are lymph nodes also. So which are the lymph nodes here? So the lymph nodes which are located along the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid. So more in the lower part, that is the supraclavicular lymph nodes, and a few in the upper part, that is occipital lymph nodes. So occipital lymph nodes and a few supraclavicular lymph nodes are located in this region. So if you see the content of the occipital triangle, first we will discuss about the nerves. The important nerve which is present under the roof of this triangle is a spinal accessory nerve. It passes or emerges from just above the middle of the posterior border of the sternocleidomastoid, passes downwards and laterally in a tunnel of the fascia formed by the fascia forming the roof of this triangle. Passing downwards and laterally, it disappears under the anterior border of the trapezius 5 cm above the clavicle. It is supplying the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius muscle. And you have 4 cutaneous branches of the cervical plexus: transverse cutaneous nerve, greater auricular nerve, the lesser occipital nerve, and also supraclavicular nerve, which is dividing into medial, intermediate, and lateral branches. And you have some muscular branches here. 2 muscular branches to the levator scapulae, 2 muscular branches to the trapezius muscle, and a branch from the brachial plexus, that is the dorsal scapular nerve. So which is it is also known as nerve to rhomboids. That is also present here, and that is about the nerves. And we have 2 vessels here. That is the occipital artery, which is present in the apex, and transverse cervical artery, which is a branch of the thyrocervical trunk. So, and the lymph nodes which are present in this region are the occipital lymph nodes and a part of supraclavicular lymph node. Now we'll go into the content of the lower part of this triangle, that is the subclavian part or the supraclavicular part. So now we are going to discuss about the contents of the subclavian triangle or the supraclavicular part. So first we'll discuss the nerves in this region. So the first, the important part is that we have the scalenus anterior muscle here, scalenus anterior, and you have the scalenus medius muscle here. So in between the scalenus medius and the scalenus anterior, you have the trunks of the brachial plexus. So there are 3 trunks of this brachial plexus, that is the upper trunk, the middle trunk, and the lower trunk are passing in the lower part of the posterior triangle, that is in the subclavian triangle, and it passes in between the scalenus anterior and the scalenus anterior and the scalenus medius muscle. So 3 trunks of the brachial plexus. And the root of brachial plexus. So the roots and the three trunks of brachial plexus are present in this region. Now from the upper trunk of the brachial plexus you have a nerve which is the suprascapular nerve. So from the upper trunk you are having the suprascapular nerve. So suprascapular nerve, which is a branch of the upper trunk of the brachial plexus, is also forming the content suprascapular nerve. And from the upper trunk you have another nerve, that is the nerve to subclavius. It passes downwards like this. That is nerve to subclavius. It is also forming the content subclavius. So here the nerves are related to the brachial plexus, that is the roots and three trunks of the brachial plexus, suprascapular nerve, nerve to subclavius. And another branch which is emerging from the root of brachial plexus is the long thoracic nerve. Long thoracic nerve. So you should know that the three trunks of the brachial plexus, they emerge between the scalenus anterior and scalenus medius, and they carry along with them the axillary sheath. Actually the axillary sheath consists of the brachial plexus and the subclavian artery. Okay, and you have seen the nerves in this region, that is the root and trunk of brachial plexus, suprascapular nerve, nerve to subclavius, and also the long thoracic nerve. So nerve to subclavius, the root value is C5, C6. This is derived from the upper trunk. And suprascapular nerve, again it is derived from the upper trunk. So root value is C5, C6. And long thoracic nerve, it is C5, C6 and C7. So these are the nerves. And the vessels here, so one vessel is the suprascapular vessel, that is suprascapular vessel. So suprascapular artery is a branch of thyrocervical trunk. It is again a branch of thyrocervical trunk. Okay, and it passes laterally and it passes behind the backwards behind the clavicle. So this is the suprascapular artery. And you have some two important vessels here, that is the subclavian artery and the subclavian vein. That is third part of subclavian artery and subclavian vein is present in this region. That is very important. That is why it is known as the subclavian triangle. Subclavian artery and subclavian vein. So it is present in this region. And you have one important vein here, that is the external jugular vein. So we have seen that external jugular vein, which is present superficially in the lower part, it pierces the roof of this triangle and it opens into the subclavian vein. So the lower part of the external jugular vein is also present in this region. External jugular vein, lower part is present in this region. So and you have the commencement of the transverse cervical artery also here, commencement of transverse cervical artery. So we have seen that the main part of the transverse cervical artery was present in the occipital triangle, but the commencement of this transverse cervical artery is present in this triangle. So and we have some lymph nodes here. So few lymph nodes of the supraclavicular chain is present here. Few lymph nodes of supraclavicular chain is present here. So these are the contents of the subclavian triangle. Okay, first we have the trunks and the roots of the brachial plexus and two branches of the upper trunk of brachial plexus, suprascapular nerve and the nerve to subclavius. And you have a branch from the root, that is the long thoracic nerve, And the vessels are the suprascapular artery. The important vessels are third part of subclavian artery and the subclavian vein. And we have the lower part of the external jugular vein here. And you have the commencement of the transverse cervical artery, and the lymph nodes present in this region are a few group of supraclavicular chain. So that is all about the posterior triangle of neck. Thank you for watching this video. To see more videos on my channel, please subscribe the channel. Thank you.